pleasure to be with you today. I have Christy Dehus. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. It doesn't look
Yes.
like I am, but we're here recording another podcast for ESG in 5 through the California Lawyers Association. And I want to thank my guest, Christy, and I'll let her pronounce her last name for us.
Yeah, so I'm Christy Dehus. I've been working in the ESG sustainability field for about 10 years. My background actually is in international development, and so I kind of came to this field working in a number of different sub-Saharan African countries, kind of seeing the impacts that corporations have on developing countries and some of the potential opportunity there. So after working with a number of different nonprofits, mostly within the consulting capacity, I decided to go back to grad school, and I got my master's degree in international human rights, and I focused on state building in Congo and corporate social responsibility. So CSR, ESG, sustainability, it's kind of all the same big umbrella. And so most of my research was focused on looking at the impact of kind of these ESG initiatives within the private sector, as well as the impact to people that they are designed to impact within the developing world. And so I focused a lot on Democratic Republic of Congo and conflict minerals specifically, and kind of the role that corporations play there. And then was hired at Apple to work on our conflict minerals program, as well as a number of their ESG initiatives across the supply chain. So was there for a number of years and worked on some of our environmental certifications. I designed the first human rights impact measurement program, really looking at the impact of Dodd-Frank and the conflict minerals rule to the people on the ground in Congo. What kind of human rights measurements are there? What kind of data can we collect to know that all the work that's being done on the downstream is really impacting folks in the upstream, and really kind of come to some statistical analysis and conclusion from that. After Apple, I left to work at ChargePoint, which is a small electric vehicle charging station company. I built their first ESG department, kind of identifying some of their key risks within ESG and preparing them for upcoming regulations, and getting kind of all the feet underneath that machine and get it going. So since then, I've mostly just been doing consulting work again, working with a number of clients in the private and nonprofit sectors, and excited to be here today to talk with you all about what's kind of happening and what we're seeing.
Well, thanks for that. You answered about 6 of my questions before I got to them, so it'll make it difficult. But I think what we're going to do is go back to a lot of those, because you said so many things that were interesting, and I didn't want to cut you off. One kind of relatively random question that comes to mind, you mentioned your focus on state building and economic development, and how corporations have a role to play in that regard. I was reading, I think Nestle's much touted ESG or reporting framework. They have like I didn't want to say CSR, but they have like a responsible sourcing framework.
Yep.
And at one point they mention the work they're doing in Western African countries to provide schooling and other kind of economic empowerment activities in Western Africa. And they made a point to address that this is counterintuitive that companies would be involved in these types of activities, but then they made the point that in order to effectuate their goals, that was a key method by which they went about. Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that you've thought a lot about those issues as well, and I'd love to hear how you feel those issues play out.
Absolutely, yeah. So when we talk about state building, that can mean a lot of things. You're looking at government actors, you're looking at civil society, you're looking at the role that the private sector plays. So it's, in a place like Congo, it's incredibly challenging. They had one of the most brutal colonialism regimes. The First and Second Congo Wars completely pillaged the country, right? You have a country that has 27 trillion in untapped natural resources and has been extremely mismanaged, and it's been an incredibly hollowed out state, right? And so when you look at some of the initiatives that have been done, specifically within like the extractive industry. Mining companies will go in and they'll say, oh, look, we like built a road, we've done some ESG. Well, actually they built a road so that they could get the mining equipment in, and that was just kind of a side benefit. So I think when we're thinking about state building, it's thinking, you want to think about it in terms of levers, right? Like what's going to be most effective. And so the challenge with Congo is that companies have such a vested interest with the natural resources, right? We have over, I think 70% of the world's resource of cobalt there, which is charges batteries. We have tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold, which go in our electronics products. And so what role really should companies play within a really challenging space and within a really hollowed out country, right? Where oftentimes politicians' pockets are lined in order to get things done. And I think it's a challenging prospect to say the least. But I think really pushing companies to look at what their programs and initiatives are and what's the impact, right? What kind of monitoring evaluation metrics are in place for that? Because the last thing you want is just for, I think we've seen this a lot with conflict minerals is like, USAID or the European Union will kind of set something up of like, oh, look, we've set up this due diligence scheme and we've got this one mine that's, we've got responsible gold, right? And so it's like, but these things tend to kind of pop up, but then the long-term impact to the country is, it's a mark that's a little bit missed, right? So I think making sure that all the right actors are kind of brought into play so that we see some sustainable progress.
The UNGPs, we should try not to play acronym soup too much, but the UN Guiding Principles on Responsible Business Conduct that were released about 10 years ago, I think they focus more on ensuring that companies don't contribute to harms, but they don't go as far as placing positive responsibilities on companies to implement kind of remediate, well, I shouldn't say they do ask companies to implement remediative efforts, but they don't necessarily ask companies to take positive steps to implement change. But I think what I mentioned with respect to the Nestle report and what other actors have found that are working for companies is that it's hard to avoid contributing to harm if you're not part of helping the situation in these developing countries that are parts of your supply chain. Is that what you found, particularly because you mentioned you have a focus on measuring impact?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, with the UNGPs, it's the protect, respect, and remedy framework.
Yep.
So they're not advocating, right, for human rights. And so it's a tricky line, right? I mean, you don't want to take this like do no harm stance, because that seems a little like just strange and odd, especially because just by essence of production, multinational corporations are the largest violator of human rights, right? And so, but it's really the state's initiative and responsibility to advance human rights and kind of be the guarantee or guarantor of human rights. But then when you're dealing with a country like Congo or a lot of developing countries where you're dealing with very corrupt governments, you're dealing with completely hollowed out states, you're not dealing with any civil society or democratic institutions that are really kind of challenging and pushing for human rights, right? So whose responsibility is it, right? In terms of being the guarantor. And so that's where things get, I think, a little bit murky. And I don't know if there's a really clear answer for, there's one prescribed way of like companies to do this. Like there's all sorts of sustainability standards out there, right? In terms of like some companies use the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a framework. Some companies use SASB. Some companies use GRI, right? I mean, there's not like one way to do this or one way to think about it. But I do think a lot of the like emerging regulation that we're seeing in Europe is going to be a really strong guide for how like kind of corralling this space and getting people on the same page.
Yeah. Based on your description of your career, it sounded like you had kind of 3 iterations where in the first in the first phase of your career, you were acting as in a nonprofit capacity, liaising with corporate actors. Then you were working in a large corporation that obviously had a massive supply chain. And my understanding is that Tim Cook, who's the CEO at Apple, grew from the supply chain ranks, and so he's been very cognizant of making sure that supply chain is incredibly important at Apple. And then your third phase of your career was working with a startup. And I was wondering if we could kind of take a beat and speak to each three of those phases and how they kind of changed each other and how they affected each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the challenges with the nonprofit space was, especially within international development, it's very much a murky swamp, right? Like, in essence, if nonprofits are really effective at their job, they wouldn't have a job anymore. So say you have a nonprofit that's working on global poverty. If they actually solve global poverty, all those people would be unemployed. And so you have this really big challenge, especially when we're dealing with donor dollars, right? I think a lot of times, if nonprofits get government funding, there can be some more restrictions around what metrics they have to put forward. So for example, at Apple, we worked a lot with the Global Fund for Human Rights. And so one of my initiatives is really to work with them on a lot of their metrics and a lot of the work that they were doing and saying, okay, how are you measuring impact, right? And I think that's something that we're seeing with the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, is that's kind of one of the biggest pieces of it, is how are you measuring impact, right? Not just what are you doing, but how do you know that it's working?
Mm.
So I think from that aspect, being on the nonprofit side and seeing some of the challenges there, I really wanted to kind of make that switch. It's corporations, just they impact so much, right? And they have so much opportunity, especially in a place like Congo, right, where there is the natural resource tie that's so strong. And so, I think kind of looking at different levers and seeing, okay, corporations are really going to have a much bigger impact over the next 20 to 40 years, right? And we look at even the evolution from of the Sustainable Development Goals, right? Like when they were rehauled, it was maybe I don't know exactly what year it is, but they were rehauled at some point, and they were more guided towards, okay, putting it within the lens of the business framework and how can companies pick this up and see that their impact within the developing world. And so that aspect of my career, I think, was really informational in terms of feeling more like on the ground and seeing more from the nonprofit perspective and kind of where does that public-private relationship intersect and what kind of impact can it have? Working at a place like Apple, I mean, I think Apple, you're completely right. Tim Cook comes from a supply chain background. He's also a very compassionate CEO. I think that sets the tone quite a bit for how companies approach ESG and how they kind of view this work. If you have leadership buy-in from the get-go, you're going to go a lot further versus trying to convince leadership like, hey, this is really important work. We're impacting people's lives throughout our supply chain. It's a business risk. It's also something that impacts our profit and our bottom line. And so when you have leadership already on board with that, yes, of course, there's going to be a number of initiatives and programs that you will lobby, but you kind of have that baseline understanding. So, of course, working at Apple had its challenges. There were certainly a number of folks that were not on board with ESG and sustainability, right? And so, and you're going to find that in any company. And so you kind of have to find your allies, leverage on them, and build that forward. And then I think moving to ChargePoint, I went from being on a big team at Apple working on these initiatives to a party of one and very much being an island. And so having to get a little bit more creative in terms of, leveraging folks that were allies that understood this work. Having executive support was super important and really kind of getting things going. And I think really just looking at, okay, starting from zero, right? What are some of the mistakes that I learned from working at Apple, and what are some things like pitfalls and things that a company starting at zero in this space can kind of avoid?
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's really so your work in the nonprofit sphere gave you a lot of guidance on how large an effect large companies have, particularly in places like Congo, where governance has less capabilities. And then your work at a large organization gave you a sense of how effective those companies can be, but at the same time, the difficulty that's involved in navigating bureaucracies of large companies because they have such a substantial effect because they're so complicated. And then your work at a smaller company gave you the sense of how much impact you could create, but at the same time, the limited scope that it has because you don't have so many people pushing in the same direction.
Yeah, no, I think
That's
you've
interesting.
packed it very nicely. Thank you.
Thanks.
One other thought too that I had kind of going back to an earlier point in our conversation was about like who is responsible for protecting human rights, right? Like we have the UNGPs, but then we're operating within, countries where there's very little government authority or accountability. And, I'll never forget at a conference years ago, there was a panel and I don't remember where the woman was from, but I remember she was literally saying like companies are not responsible. Like it is not our job, yes, to advocate for human rights. But then we kind of come back to this conundrum where you can't say, oh, okay, well, the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo is going to advocate for human rights because they're not, right? I mean, you say that about a lot of countries. And so, who does the responsibility fall on if it's not companies? I think is really it's a very challenging space to be in.
One question I have is it a function in a lot of developing countries of cultural constraints and cultural traditions, which lead to their having less regard for, let's say, quote unquote, human rights, or what they might describe as Western style human rights? Is it a cultural issue, or is it more just a lack of capacity? So we talked about, in lots of areas of the world that government doesn't have the ability to properly implement a lot of their policies, or is it a bit of both?
Yeah, I mean, I think the culture piece is certainly something to take into consideration. So, for example, a lot of my work has been in China just by nature of supply chain, and at one of the companies that I worked with, I worked really closely with one of our partners in China on some modern slavery work. And I was kind of putting forward this training, and he had a lot of issues with the facts and statistics in the training and how it kind of portrayed China. And I think it's really difficult when we're dealing with countries that don't have the same understanding of what human rights are as we do, with the same experience, the same level of freedoms and abilities to articulate and express human rights. And so, I think the culture piece is something that's really important. I mean, I will say, working a lot with China and Chinese companies, they are very, very good at, like if you kind of give a formula, right? Like very specific guidelines, right? Here are our metrics. Here's what we need you to do. Okay, bam, 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 bam. But some of the I think more getting things out of the box can be really, really challenging. And human rights is not something that's necessarily easily prescriptive, right? I mean, there's certain things like when we go into a factory, are they stopping laborers from organizing and collective bargaining? Are they holding people's passports, right? Like there are very specific things that we can point to and say, okay, like that's a human rights violation. Like, let's make sure that that's not happening. But I think sometimes too, like there are things that, you just by walking around of like, oh, like, why is this fire alarm entrance or this emergency exit entrance blocked, right? Just like kind of things that you may not necessarily pick up in an audit. And I think getting companies to, I think, really understand some of the environment and human rights due diligence beyond a prescriptive checklist is really important, but there are some cultural boundaries there that make things challenging.
One of the points that came up through your answer in that last question, I wanted to ask, my understanding of the electronic supply chain is that you have minerals that are mined in several different places, oftentimes developing countries, so that you reference your experience in sub-Saharan Africa. That's kind of the bottom of the supply chain where the minerals are coming out of the ground. Then they're often transshipped to let's say China, for instance, where they're smelted and then assembled into electronics actual electronics. And that's usually along the eastern seaboard of China. That's the Shenzhen area of China. And it sounds like your experience in the supply chain went through the supply chain from the mines to the smelters to the assembly and then along here.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've certainly kind of touched every aspect from working with miners in Congo to dealing with smelters in Vietnam, all over Southeast Asia, all over China as well, in terms of saying, hey, like we have these initiatives, we have these programs, we have these policies in place, getting smelters to be audited by a third party. And then across the larger supply chain as well, in terms of not just final assembly, test and pack, FATP, but every single aspect of, is this a glass supplier? Are they working on, even just a particular sticker, right? And so really, I think touching every single piece of the supply chain is really important when we think about ESG and our risk collectively. And I think also pushing, not just having it be at the end tier of the supply chain, but really, I think pushing that responsibility and getting companies all on board with it. So for like example, one of the companies that I have worked with, when I set up their code of conduct program and really kind of looked at, okay, what are we asking our suppliers to be responsible for? Really getting their buy-in and their initiative, not just saying, okay, hey, do what we ask you to do, but getting that leveling down the supply chain in terms of getting those requirements passed on to their sub-suppliers and getting them to hold not just themselves accountable, but their sub-suppliers accountable. And I think we're also seeing that too within the EU's the CSDDD, like the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. It's always such a mouthful, but we're kind of seeing that in terms of like, okay, you really have to make sure that these requirements are being passed down at every level of your supply chain to have the most robust risk mitigation that is really required.
Yeah, I'm glad we got into this alphabet soup point. I wanted to mention, call back to something earlier you said about the disagreements that you can encounter within companies where reasonable minds can differ with respect to what companies are responsible to do vis-a-vis, human rights and supply chains and sustainability and all those things. Our job as lawyers isn't necessarily to opine on the morals of things. I mean, obviously that's contributed to our advice, but what we need to do is think through what the governments are prescribing these companies to do. So one of those things you mentioned was the EU corporate social. I don't even want to do that. EU corporate social sustainability direct. Because we're based in California, I wanted to just make clear that U.S. companies are subject to this law, to what's going to be this draft directive. If that's your understanding, and could you explain a bit more how U.S. companies are subject to this law?
Yeah, so there's a certain number of entry points for being subjected to the law. I don't want to be misquoted here, but if I recall correctly, I know one of it has to do with revenue, number of employees within Europe. So, if you're a small company and you only operate in California and let's say you just make t-shirts, you're probably not going to be subjected to this, right? So you have to have some sort of revenue and employee threshold to hit that. I wonder if we should start over because my phone just rang.
Okay. That happens. I think the audience appreciates that you have a phone. It's hopefully it's an iPhone, right?
Yep.
So yeah, this wasn't meant to be a pop quiz, but the point is there's several different types of U.S. companies who have subsidiaries or who do business based on revenue or employee size that are subject to the EU's regulations with respect to reporting and compliance with human rights due diligence related to sustainability as well as human rights. One thing you mentioned off the cuff was the Dodd-Frank Act. Could you tell us a bit more about the Dodd-Frank Act and how that affected your role at Apple?
Absolutely, yeah. So the conflict minerals rule that was in place within Dodd-Frank it really required, or it created this entire industry of due diligence within the conflict minerals supply chain. And so, I think when we're thinking about, and you touched on it a little bit of like, what's legal's role? What's kind of companies' role? Corporations are not moral entities, but they are made up of people who are moral entities. And so how do we kind of balance that fine line? And so what we have seen with the conflict minerals rule is that it has created a lot of awareness around this ESG risk within the conflict minerals supply chain. And it has required companies to do something. Was it the right course of action? We don't know. I think that's something that is still being researched and questioned quite a bit. I do think with the more recent SEC climate rule that's on the horizon, there's a lot of lessons learned from the conflict minerals rule. For example, originally there was an auditing portion within the conflict minerals rule that ended up being thrown out. We do see that with the climate rule, which requires a higher level of accountability. It more embeds it within the finance function within a company. We're thinking about auditing of numbers. And so I think that that's something that's really important and a lesson learned from Dodd-Frank and the conflict minerals rule. So, I think when we think about, one of the challenges we see with all regulations is the enforcement piece, right? And that's kind of one of the trends within ESG as a whole, right? So take, for example, the UN Global Compact, which companies can sign on to saying, hey, look, we uphold the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We've implemented the framework within our operations. But there's not auditing, there's no kind of measurement enforcement mechanism to say, okay, like we've looked at what you're actually doing and you're not really meeting this. And so that's a vacuum within this space is really having a level of accountability. At the end of the day, in order for ESG to work really well, consumers need to be holding corporations accountable, right? Because they really hold that profit line. And so I think the more education we can do with executives, with companies, with consumers around why is this important? Why do we need to care? How does this impact the environment and human rights around the world is one of the bigger challenges that we kind of see within this space.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is reflective of the kind of the general trends in the 21st century around, responsible business conduct. In the first part of the 21st century, in the aughts, as they say, there was CSR, there's corporate social responsibility, and that was kind of an amorphous concept. And there wasn't much auditing, there wasn't much review of the statements that companies would make. And with respect to kind of the law, it would be considered as puffery or something that couldn't be enforced through litigation, let's say, and obviously speaking generally. Then the next iteration is kind of the ESG trend where we are now, and that arose partly through finance. And so there was a sense that the statements that you make in the ESG context need to be grounded more in quantifiable concepts so that you can corroborate the statements that you made. And that's because investors are going to be looking at those issues to make sophisticated investment decisions. And now you have things like the SEC that's proposing these regulations that require auditing and a bit more of a corroboration, let's say. And similarly, you have things like sustainability litigation where consumers are holding companies to more of an account with respect to the statements that they make and how the impact statements they make are actually verifiable. Did you do a bit of work on the verification piece when you were in your private practice, when you were at the companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole process that is put in place with SEC filings that is quite robust. So even though it would be unlikely that the SEC would audit on conflict minerals, I think making sure that everything is buttoned up in terms of documentation and where are documents stored, are they electronic, are they paper, right? Kind of all those pieces. And so I think that that's a good, it's a good trial run, I think, for companies to be prepared. Now, I don't think every single company has been as robust on some of these things. I mean, you can go through the SEC filings on conflict minerals and it can be everywhere from, like an Apple or a Google report that has a number of mentions of programs and initiatives in addition to their smelter data and their reasonable country of origin data, to companies that literally have one sentence that says, we've mapped our supply chain and we found no issues, right? And so it's like, and again, that goes back to the challenge of there's not enforcement, there's not enough clarity around, hey, here's what you have to do, or there's too much wiggle room in terms of, well, we can kind of just do the bare minimum. But then you have companies like Apple and a lot of the larger companies that have had more influence within this space, they've really been held accountable by a lot of NGOs, right? We look at the work of the Enough Project, and they did a whole ranking for I think 2 or 3 years in a row of how companies were doing on conflict minerals, right? And so leveraging that space, I think, in terms of the advocacy, you look at the Amnesty International campaign on cobalt, that really pushed companies to do a lot on cobalt, right? That they previously weren't doing before. So, or like a New York Times or a Washington Post article coming out about these pieces, right? Like those are all things that kind of nudge companies in the way that they should go. And so, I think the SEC has certainly kind of looked at that and had some lessons learned. I do think when we compare the climate rule to Dodd-Frank, we see a number of differences and a number of improvements. And so, I'm glad that we kind of have had some trial runs and companies have kind of gone through that process of how do we, for an SEC filing, typically those are like financial documents, right? It's not ESG related at all. And so how do we kind of leverage, how do we put ESG within kind of the finance bucket and the reporting bucket and some of those regulatory government requirements?
And maybe we should just make clear when we're referring to Dodd-Frank, we're referring to the kind of omnibus financial regulation bills that came out of the great financial crisis from 2008, 2009. So Dodd and Frank issued all of these different regulations. One's random kind of rider that was involved was this point about that required public companies to report on their exposure to conflict minerals and what they're doing in response to conflict minerals, how they're managing their supply chain with respect to that. Another law that we're both familiar with that's out of California, which came out around the same time, was a California Transparency in Supply Chains Act. And that similarly doesn't require companies to implement sourcing initiatives itself, but what it does is it requires companies that have sourcing initiatives to report those initiatives. Were you ever involved in reporting vis-a-vis the California Supply Chain Transparency Act?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that I've certainly touched on that on a number of different roles. And so there's a lot of similarities to our conflict minerals filing, as well as our statements on modern slavery, right? In terms of how we approach them, how we think about them. I mean, that was something that, in companies that I've been in, it has been discussed too. Like, what if Dodd-Frank, what if the SEC rule completely went away? Will we still do our conflict minerals reports? Will we still update them every year? Would they all be publicly posted somewhere, right? I think one of the challenges with the modern slavery disclosure that we see, not just in California, but the Australian Modern Slavery Act, the UK Modern Slavery Act, is, again, that enforcement piece, right? And that's the challenge we have with conflict minerals. We don't have these reports being audited. We don't have an enforcement body. There's kind of no, no strong penalty. And that's really why I am intrigued by the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, is because there actually is a legal component of it. If you don't comply with this, you can be sued, and no company wants to be taken to court over like ESG issues, right? And so I think that that's something where, when we look at the Modern Slavery Act and, a lot of the SEC filings so far, is there is that missing accountability piece. And so I think it's good to see that shift, because it's going to require a lot more of companies in terms of their robustness and how seriously they take these initiatives.
Yeah. In the US, we don't have as much of a rigorous enforcement mechanism with respect to requiring companies to do human rights due diligence and investigate their supply chain. One thing that has been hopeful is the passage of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which doesn't necessarily require due diligence as such, but effectively requires companies to map their supply chain and assess their exposure to human rights abuses related to the Uyghur minorities in Xinjiang. Have you had any involvement in working with companies on their UFLPA compliance?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting about the UFLPA is the leverage of the Customs and Border Patrol, right? And so like actually seizing goods.
Miss, apologies. Maybe we should just take a second to explain a bit how the law works. And since I'm the lawyer, I'm the lawyer on the call, maybe I'll give it a whirl and you can modify it as you see fit. So the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act came into force in June of 2022, and it basically establishes a rebuttable presumption which says that any goods that have a nexus to the Xinjiang region or Uyghur labor are going to be presumed to have been produced using forced labor. And goods that are produced using forced labor are prohibited from entering the US pursuant to Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930. And so if the USCBP, who's the enforcement body for this act, the USCBP is US Customs and Border Protection. If the USCBP detains an importer's shipment and states that it suspects that this shipment is subject to the act, i.e. it has a nexus to Uyghur labor, then that company would have to submit a copious amount of documents to prove that it can rebut the presumption, as it were, of forced labor. And of course and I'd love to hear your input on how difficult it would be to acquire reliable documents sufficient to rebut that presumption. And in fact, there's been no reports of any company successfully rebutting the presumption that goods it's imported that are subject to the act haven't been produced using forced labor. Right. What most companies have been focused on is mapping their supply chain and providing evidence to USCBP that their goods aren't subject to the act, i.e. their goods don't have a nexus to Uyghur labor. Yeah. So a lot of companies in their efforts to comply with the act have been mapping their supply chains and determining all the way down their supply chains who are the relevant actors.
Absolutely.
So that gives a bit of a background of the UFLPA, and maybe you could tell us a bit more about your work in any of these areas.
Yeah, and so I think you gave a really nice summary and a really good perspective on, you're very spot on in terms of, one of the main steps of action is mapping the supply chain, right? And determining, okay, do we know for sure that we have sourced from this region or we have not, right? And so if you're a company and you map your supply chain and you can pinpoint and say, okay, we are not sourcing at all from this region, then you're relatively safe. Now, the challenge with this is that within China, there is no forced labor, right? Like this is not seen, the Uyghur region is a very, very, very contentious issue. It's very difficult to ask questions about this issue specifically within China. And so, I think kind of that's something that I don't know some of the backdoor conversations that were held in the drafting of the UFLPA, but that's something that I think we have to kind of be mindful of. What was interesting was they did actually release an entire list of companies that they know to have been sourcing Uyghur forced labor. And so that I think was really fascinating to like really kind of call out really specific companies within China. It made it very clear in terms of, okay, do we source from these companies or do we not, right? So it's kind of these two lanes of, do you source from the region or do you source from these companies? Now, I think that there's certainly some holes within this, right? You can certainly, map your supply chain and say, we don't buy from this, but that doesn't mean that you're, that's completely effective or foolproof, right? I mean, I think that these things are much more nebulous and complex than we think they are. And so I think it's a good first step. I think it's a really fascinating approach in terms of the geographic approach, as well as actually providing a list of companies. But I think, we've got, again, we go back to that cultural problem, right? If you can't talk about the Uyghur region at all within China, if you can't even say that there's forced labor within China, you're really butting up against a really difficult wall here. So I don't know that I have the answer for that. I think that's hit some bigger geopolitical challenges, and hopefully one day we'll make more progress there in terms of like, our understanding of human rights, right? I mean, I think when we think about human rights, a lot of this ties back to, the end of World War II and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and a lot of these human rights documents that came out of World War II, and kind of all the countries being on the same page globally of, we don't really want to have another one of these world wars. This is awful, right? And I feel like we've kind of lost some of that sense of unity and cohesion on some of these basic human rights principles. And how do we get back there, right?
Yeah, the UN Declaration that was spearheaded by Eleanor Roosevelt, and that came out of San Francisco, where you're based, right?
Yeah.
Could we talk a bit? Were you involved in any reporting in your work at ChargePoint, or was it a smaller company and therefore not subject to as robust reporting requirements?
Yeah, no, I managed our conflict minerals filing. We had our first run out the gate while I was there. And I think one of the biggest challenges is taking best practices, right? So we look at the OECD due diligence guidance and those 5 steps, and kind of managing, really kind of building our program from the ground up of like taking these frameworks and making sure that they're correctly aligned and what our initiatives are in our programs. I also managed our modern slavery disclosures and worked really closely with the legal team on those pieces as well. Those were the 2 main regulations that we were required to disclose on. I think as the due diligence directive out of Europe continues to formulate, will be in scope. They will be in scope for that. And so seeing how that comes through. Same thing with the SEC climate rule. So a lot of the regulations, that we see today, the most of the companies I've been involved with were subjected to that, and trying to figure out, okay, what's the best way for us to report out on this? What makes sense, especially being a smaller company, having less to say, but still having a very public eye. And you talked a little bit about the ESG piece and the investors and the finance, right? And how that's kind of driving a lot of this initiative, which I think is a really important lever in this space. And so where investor dollars are going, companies want to do that, right? So.
And yeah, I think it's really fascinating how our 2 work streams really kind of work together, and that often a lot of my work involves advising companies on what the law requires and helping them develop a framework to implement the requirements of the law. And a lot of the work that you do is again, analysis of the laws and implementing those frameworks, and also implementing in a way that is the most effective as possible based on your experience 10 years working abroad. One thing maybe we could just take a beat on is to describe for the listener how conflict minerals are implicated in ChargePoint, electric vehicle charging. And you mentioned earlier cobalt, and so cobalt is used to make lithium ion, and that's used to make batteries. But then you mentioned gold, tantalum, tin, and what was I'm forgetting?
Tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold.
Tungsten. Yeah. Maybe you could just give us a bit of a background on how electronic products are implicated in conflict minerals, because I think a lot of just general consumers aren't aware.
Absolutely. So if you go to any charging station, you'll see that there's a screen, there's touch, there's buttons, there's kind of all of these electronic components within the actual charging station, right? So anytime it could be something as simple as like a Game Boy, a toy,
a Walkman. Like, how do you want to go back to the 80s? A Walkman, a Discman.
Right. So, tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold are present pretty much in any electronic piece that you have. So you could have a vacuum that has electronics in it, right? You could have a microwave. You could have, any kind of general household appliance. It's going to have some sort of electrical component to it. Now, I'm not, well versed in every single product out there and knowing, okay, what has tantalum, tin, tungsten, or gold. but charging stations certainly do have a large electronics component. And so that's kind of where those minerals come into play. Charging stations typically don't have cobalt, right? They're hooked up directly to the grid. That creates a different ESG risk in that, you have charging stations, but are they hooked up to a clean grid or to a dirty grid, right? Or is that grid using renewable energy or is it not, right? Because the amount of power that it extracts from the grid has implications as well. And so, I think it's not just thinking about the design, the manufacturing of the actual product and the materials within that product and their ESG risks, but the use of that product and what are the environment and human rights implications of that, right? And I think oftentimes we think of environment and human rights as two separate buckets, but the reality is the environment is a human right, and so there's this huge kind of environmental justice cross section that we're now seeing and understanding, and so I think it's important to make sure that we don't put them in two different buckets because there's a significant amount of crossover there. So, but yeah, I mean, the tantalum, tin, tungsten, and gold, the 3 TGs are present in a lot of electronics materials. And so I think when we, and that's kind of one of the effectiveness of Dodd-Frank is that it does touch such a large swath of industry. But again, you can look at filings and be like, oh, this person or this company just literally has one sentence about what they're doing, right? And a lot of that I think just goes to, over the last several years, what really drove companies doing more on their conflict minerals reports was the NGO and advocacy arena, right? And we've kind of see that start to drift and dip, and now everything's really focused on climate goals, right? And becoming net zero by 2030. And really addressing a lot of the climate impacts. And so that certainly has a human rights element to it that's very, very critical. But a lot of these more nebulous issues of across the supply chain, I think, is being looked at in a very different light.
Yeah, one thing I try to say often is as lawyers, we're trained and responsible for advising on the current state of the law. But to give really sophisticated advice, it also involves using your experience to project where the law might be in 5 years and what companies might want to do today to ensure that they're going to be meeting their goals in 5 years from now. With that in mind, one final question is, where do you see some of these issues heading over the course of the next 5 or 10 years? We talked about the EU Corporate Sustainability Act. We talked about the SEC potentially having their requirements for reporting. What are some other issues that you think might come up over the course of the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I could say, yeah, we know for sure what this is going to look like in 5 to 10 years. I mean, I think what I would like to see is I would like to see a lot more educated consumers on this and really see them pushing the ball on it. Right now, we've got a lot of regulation-driven initiatives on ESG. I would like to see, I think, some revival within the advocacy and NGO space of pushing companies on this. I think that's, again, kind of shifted to the climate change awareness and initiatives around climate change specifically. And I think I would love to see there be more conversation around the human rights element of climate change and how I think people understand it kind of broadly, but I think, when we look at reports and whatnot, these things all tend to be, within separate buckets, or you'll see companies talk about ESG, they have an environment section, they have a social section, they have a governance section, but a lot of these areas tend to overlap, right? I like a lot of reports where they kind of talk about the impact of, people, product, and planet, right? So like, it's not a bad thing to have kind of categories and ways in which we talk about it, but I think, recognizing where some of the intersections are and the impact of that. I think a lot of this regulation is coming out of Europe in terms of more ESG focused regulation. We don't see as much within the US. For example, the California Modern Transparency and Supply Chains Act has not been updated in a long time. And that's just for California. There's nothing happening nationally that's a requirement. You know, I know a number of initiatives that have been kind of put forward in Congress to have some broader ESG regulation. Nothing has passed. I would like to see some more shift in that direction. I think also too, when we're talking about and thinking about regulation, a lot of times, and the SEC conflict minerals rule is a great example of this. There was a huge impact in China. There was a huge impact in Congo for that. But I think there was a little bit lacking in terms of pulling in those groups as stakeholders to inform the law before it was drafted and passed. You know, I think that that's something that's going to be really important, because a lot of times this regulation is coming from the US and it's coming from Europe, and it's impacting developing countries, and they have a very different way of approaching a lot of these issues and risks. And so I think bridging that gap and making sure that the way in which the law is designed, that those people that it's impacting the most have had a say and you know, some participation and input into how the law is developed. So I think that that's something that's currently a gap area that I'm hoping over the next 5 to 10 years we'll see some progress there.
Thanks very much for that. And I do have one final question. What are some interesting things you're reading or writing on this topic?
Yeah, so there was recently a report put out by the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, and they basically like look at the last 10 years of conflict minerals and really evaluating the SEC Dodd-Frank rule and looking at how's this really played out on the ground. And it's a very comprehensive report that I found to be very fascinating. And then also kind of talks about some of the emerging regulation in Europe as well, and kind of within the conflict mineral space, how is that all going to play out? You know, I think one of the challenges that we kind of, I think, brushed on this a little bit, but I think education and really understanding what is ESG, what is the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, how should companies really be doing this? One of my favorite books is The Evolution of a Corporate Idealist by Christine Bader. And she was one of the individuals that worked on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. She was one of the advisors. So I think understanding how these things came to be is really important. So those are kind of two things that I would say, like, you know, are top of mind for me.
Well, in that regard, thank you so much for coming on and educating our audience about so many of these issues and giving us a sense of all the work that you've been doing. And it's been really fantastic work, and I'd love to have you on again. So thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.